it's preparing the live stream now. It's approximately 2:26 p.m. today, and it's after the Easter weekend. And we are basically going to have a really good interactive Q&A discussion here. The Q&A discussion is regarding the legal and financial aspects of so much of what is going to be facing us in the next, I don't know, next few months, perhaps the next few years. As always, Tubules Live Together is coming to you to help you address a lot of these issues. We try and get you experts. We try and get you people who can really give you insights and information that is useful. But first, here we are with our usual Tubules video.
Now is not the time for a webinar. That was 2009. For over 10 years at Tubules, we've been bringing dentistry together without bias. Sometimes we've been misunderstood. Our path was blocked because people thought we were self-serving, but our purpose has always been bigger than just us. It's always been about cohesion. It's for those who selflessly share and those who inspire each other. It's for those who want to grow and look out for each other on the way. Our webinars evolved to live streaming Tubules Live and our hands-on roadshows. Our study clubs have been bristling hubs of activity all over the country, growing together. Fast forward to this most recent challenge sent to test all our resilience. In a storm, we rely on what built us. In the immediate grief, we created Tubules Live Aid, advice on how to cope and how to heal the wounds. What next? Now is our time for bringing dentistry together with the same spirit. The profession needs unity, don't you think? We launched the new dedicated Tubules Live Aid section on our website. Open access and free for all. Tubules Live Together sessions, bundling all of the Tubules spirit into real conversations with real people daily. Tubules-minded experts helping to restart our journey ahead. A discussion area to share worries, concerns, and selflessly share advice and support. Sign up today. No credit card details required for base membership and access the power of Tubules togetherness.
Well, welcome to another Tubules Live Together. It's a specially put together one for an afternoon with topics and questions related around very important discussions, especially for practice owners. And I'd like to introduce two guests today who've willingly shared their time. I'll first introduce gentleman Richard Lishman, who is the MD of the Finance 4 group. Welcome, Richard, to this afternoon. And thank you for sparing your time today.
My pleasure.
And Richard, tell us a bit about yourself, your background. I know you're an independent financial advisor. You're the MD of Finance 4 Group. Give us a bit more background about this.
Yeah. Some 25 years ago, I set up the 4 Dentist Group, and what we are is we're a group of specialist professionals advising dentists on all topics from financial, accountancy, law, tax, practice sales acquisitions, any professional services within dentistry. Then we're there to help.
And I think, you've got a really good team behind you. So, and thank you for introducing us and bringing along our next guest today, Stephen Knowles. Stephen, welcome to today's show. It's really good to have you on. There we are. We can unmute you now. Stephen, what's your background and what do you do now?
Yeah, I'm a commercial lawyer. Have been for too long that I care to remember. But I've been specialising in dentistry for about 15, 16 years. I come from PFM Dental Legal, and dentistry is all we do. The bulk of our work is buying and selling of dental practices and advice on subsidiary matters such as NHS contracts and so on and so forth. And I'm also current chair of the Association of Specialist Providers to Dentists, who has a co-member in Richard as well. So dentistry being a small village, we're all interconnected to some extent.
And like I say, we're all in this together. So, I mean, the question I'm going to start with, which is obviously in everyone's mind here, is I don't know how long this is going to last for. So I don't know how to plan for it. I mean, budgeting. Where do I go? What do I think? Richard, have you had these queries from people? Because they're obviously asking you for financial advice. They're asking you for planning. What do you do?
Yeah, budgeting is a big thing because dentistry is very unique, especially with some of the support that should potentially be provided, but unfortunately isn't being provided to everybody. So what we are doing with regards to the budgeting is asking for clients to complete a income and expenditure, just because everybody, what we tend to do is we set up a direct debit and then you forget about it, however small or however big it is. Now, with the current financial problems that people seem to be having and will be having over the next few weeks and months, because we don't know how long this is going to be for, is if they actually run through every single expense that they have regarding things from their gas bill, mortgages, car leases, things that you may not even think about, like your gym memberships, or should I say gym direct debit mandates. A lot of people don't use them, but again, it's when you come to a time like this that you really have to look at what you are paying for, absolutely everything. And then what we are doing then is analysing all of these expenses. Certain things can be suspended, like mortgage payments, lease payments. Other things can actually be heavily reduced. So things like a Sky payment, some clients may be paying £150 a month for Sky. Now, there could be an option to suspend those premiums depending on if Sky would accept that. But you can actually go and renegotiate with that provider. And we've done this exercise for clients, whereas rather than paying £150 a month, you can reduce it down to £25 a month. So again, little things like this that you may not initially think, oh, yeah, it's just a direct debit, I'm paying for it, that's what I should be paying. In actual fact, more people than not are generally paying over the odds for these things. So this is actually a good time because we've all got time on our hands doing different things. It's a good time to really start analysing your own financial planning, because you'll be able to make your finances a lot leaner today for the future.
And this then ties into making sure you try to keep your cash flow going. Ultimately, the thinking behind this, especially for practices that are businesses, is understanding cash flow, because you try and reduce your expenses, your direct debits. That cash is going to last longer, and stretch it as far as you can.
Yeah, that's right. And, it's not just about your own personal financial planning. It's about your business financial planning as well. And, speaking to your suppliers, trying to renegotiate the price that you're paying. Perhaps half a dozen of local practices get together and say, let's set up a little bit of a collective rather than me going to 3M for materials, etc. Let's 6 of us or 12 of us get together, or set up a dental tribulus group that can go back, because it's all about, powers in numbers at the end of the day. Set up a corporate deal and everybody benefits.
Right. And Stephen, have you had these sort of issues happening? Because you were probably in the middle of transactions. You were probably, some starting off, some at the other end, and we'll obviously discuss this a bit later. But where does that fit in? Because there are outstanding costs for people, etc.
Yeah, very much so. A lot of the sales and purchases that we've been involved with clearly have, if not stopped altogether, then the buyers are slow pedaling, I think is the term, to try and get some certainty before proceeding to an exchange of contracts on anything, which quite frankly seems sensible in the current climate. So everyone's kind of get some certainty to see what income's going to come in, what cash is going to go out, and so on and so forth. So we're seeing that very much in the marketplace. But I would agree with Richard, just even in relation to my own business, it's surprising how many of your suppliers will take the view that some payment in the current climate is a good payment, and therefore they are much, much more flexible in dealing with time for payments of invoices and so on and so forth. I think most people would rather see something coming in on the drip as opposed to someone stopping payment altogether. So if you haven't had those conversations with your suppliers, I think you'll probably find a lot of them more open to a payment plan than they would be previously. So well worth looking into.
Well, it's keeping again. It's answering that, keeping the cash flow going in these sort of situation, really, isn't it? And I mean, the other thing that I am keep thinking about here is, do you think the NHS payments and the NHS practices are any safer?
I think
And where
I
is
think
that going to happen? Do we have any clarity on this?
clarity. Who would like to have clarity? I think one of the issues that we were talking about before we went live, so to speak, is the fact that unfortunately devolution means that there are different approaches being taken in each of the 4 home nations to NHS payments, for example. So it's not easy to say, well, this is happening in England, therefore that's happening in Wales, because they're adopting slightly different approaches between the various jurisdictions. Obviously, in England, I would say that NHS practices have been given a degree of financial certainty over and above their private practice counterparts, by at least some comfort being given in terms of NHS contract payments moving forward. Unfortunately, there's still unknowns, so we don't know for how long that certainty is going to go on for. The letter that came out from the CDO on the 25th of March talked about a period to be agreed. Well, that's great. How long is that period going to be? And also, we know that there's going to be a deduction from contract payments for things like consumables and so on and so forth that practices are not now incurring, obviously, because by and large they're shut from routine treatments. So the precise pounds, shillings and pence that you're going to get in your bank account is probably yet to be determined. But at least there is some form of financial guarantee being given in NHS practices, whereas those in private practices are far from so certain. And then add in that some of the government supports initiatives, which I'm sure we'll get to, seem more favourable to an NHS practice in some respects than private. So, for example, at least NHS associates should be getting some payment from their NHS contract payment, whereas those private associates, certainly the ones earning over £50,000 in profits, aren't qualifying for the government support scheme. So again,
Is this going to be looked at? Do we know?
I would certainly hope so, in my view. It certainly deserves to be. If you compare it, obviously, with employees, I can be earning £200,000 a year through the PAYE system, and I will at least qualify for furlough to the cap of £2,500. However, if I'm earning £50,000 or more tradable profits as a self-employed associate, I don't qualify at all.
But again, there's a bit of unclarity in payments as well. Isn't there some talk about the NHS staff will have to be deployed, and some saying, what if my staff don't choose to be deployed? Do you know what the clarity on that is at any level?
Simple answer is I don't for sure. There is a very new publication on the NHS England's site in terms of redeployment of NHS staff, which is worth a read if you get the chance. It talks about that redeployment process being voluntary. So if you follow that in pure legalistic terms, then voluntary should mean voluntary. Whether as the crisis develops and in particular staffing shortages become acute, particularly in urgent dental treatment centres and so on and so forth, a rethink then has to be occasioned so that voluntary now does not mean voluntary and it is mandatory if you want your NHS contract payment. Who knows?
We don't know really. And I guess from a finance perspective, again, Richard, you've probably been asked this again and again and again, because ultimately it's not just cutting costs, which was the first part of what you were saying, look at your debits, cash flow, but you're still going to need some element of injection at some level, especially if this lasts longer. We just don't know. So what are your thoughts on private practices, NHS practices? Where do we go with this?
Well, it's difficult. Obviously, 100% NHS practice, then they're not financially disadvantaged as such. There'll still be some shortcomings there, but generally it's the mixed practices. There's a big grey area. Because private practices, we know they're getting nothing at the moment. And as Stephen just mentioned, it's not really fair that if you've got, in fact, on a group a couple of weeks ago, there was a a dentist, single mother, earning £52,000 a year.
Yeah.
And she obviously doesn't qualify for anything, working as an associate.
Correct.
So, whereas if there was let's say a lawyer and a financial advisor that were married, which we're not. Just examples there, but lighten the mood. And let's say each of those were earning £100,000 a year as employed, then that couple would still benefit from the government support, whereas the single mother wouldn't.
And I mean, we've just literally, Reshma's come in and so, someone's just saying, if you're an NHS practice, but you earned less than 50K last year, do you still qualify for the private support scheme as well as the NHS 80% redeployment? Does anybody have clarity on that? Because you're less than 50K, so you will get something, but do you then go for your self-employed or do you go for the 80% NHS? How do you make that decision?
Well, from what the CDO stated, that if you're claiming the NHS, you can't claim for anything else. Is that your understanding, Steve?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. In the initial letter that the CDO published, she talks about duplication of support. And so I guess the argument would be that I get my NHS entitlement under the NHS support that's being provided, but can I therefore then divorce that from my, in quotes, earnings overall, to argue that my earnings are under 50K to allow me to do the government support scheme? I'm guessing probably not, would be my guess in the current climate. I suspect that if you are an NHS associate getting paid as normal under the NHS contract, that you're probably going to be in the same territory as a private associate who earns less than 50,000. That would be my guess, but frankly, I don't know.
Well, I think, this is quite interesting because we're almost talking about sources of support because, for example, I am at some level a director of a company for dentinal tubules. I'm also a self-employed private dentist who, as an associate, and I also do some teaching in the local hospital, so where I'm employed. So I have various incomes, and all at different levels. I've never figured which one's plus minus 50K. I learned that from now, and it's really confusing, isn't it? And if somebody is in that kind of a situation and they're doing NHS work, which I don't, but if they were, it's various sources of support that they have to look at, and invariably it would seem like no government's going to let you open every single tap. I would think that you'll have to almost rely on one source of support rather than many. Would you agree on that level?
Yeah, I would, because it's all under the one umbrella.
Yeah.
Really, just because somebody's chosen or that they do actually have multiple income streams, that's not really for the government to say that's good, bad or indifferent. What they're doing is providing financial support under that umbrella. Yeah. So would you say that's thereabouts, Steve?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm just briefly looking at the printouts from the government website in terms of this self-employed support scheme. And what it's saying from there is that your self-employed profits must be less than 50,000 and more than half of your income come from self-employment. So they're obviously developing some forms of testing in terms of multiple sources of income in order that, you can't have £100,000 from somewhere and lo and behold, I still qualify on the other limb. So I think it would appear that there's going to be some assessment of where you get your income from and what sources of income streams you have before you're going to apply for the self-employment support stream.
There's two things here as well. When we look at sources of support, we're talking about individual sources of support. But then there's also practices and their sources of support. What are, if you said these are the individuals, these are the practices, are you able to list the sources of support and what are the pros and cons? Are you able to kind of give us some insight into that?
Yeah,
Richard, possibly you can start with that.
There are all sorts of different, the grants, there's loans, obviously there's the furloughing. It really comes down to the individuals, if they're an associate, if they're a mixed private or NASH practice. So there's so many different permutations within dentistry. It's very unique, and for us to say one sort of solution fits all, it just doesn't. And the problem is you may have one dentist, use the example of twin dentists. One of them may be NHS 100%, they're financially stable, whereas their brother is 100% private, maybe does some lecturing, etc. Then they are very financially unsecured, because they don't know, they may not qualify for the business rate relief as well, which is maxed at £15,000 and so on. So it's not just a one cap fits all. It definitely isn't, and that's what's frustrating. That's the frustrations that we're seeing coming through from all of these groups as well.
What about CBILS? Are you getting the same? Because the stories are mixed. Some people say we've easily got the loan, and some people are turning around and saying banks are charging interest rates of 10+%, or personal guarantees. Has there been any clarity on this? Because the government was trying to put some stamp on that.
Yeah, well, initially the banks weren't really very forthcoming on this side, but then there was an announcement that basically the government stated, well, we've helped bail you banks out. You need to take one for the team and support the country now. And the banks have rolled the sleeves up. The problem is, you've got to remember that within the banks, you've got limited staff as well, because a lot of staff are unwell themselves. They have been off sick due to, by this time of year, it's not just C19, it's all the other ailments and illnesses that we have over the winter months. So when they're on skeleton staff, bringing in a ridiculous amount of work and having most of the country contacting them and applying for the support, it's difficult.
And I guess they've had to furlough staff as well.
Yeah, they have. Yeah, absolutely. It's a difficult position for every business. It's not just dentists, it's not just lawyers, it's not financial advisors. It's all of us are in this together, and it's not just in the UK; it's worldwide. So the economy's been hit. Everything's been absolutely blasted at this moment in time. Now, that's why we need to sort of work out what's going to be the bigger picture. So yes, there are grants available, there are loans available, but we're not all going to be able to apply today, because we just can't do it. It's a bottleneck. Now, with regards to the loans, now if somebody prior to this problem coming about had applied for a loan, okay, and generally what would have happened if they would have been accepted on standard terms, then they will be the individuals that will get the standard terms now, and they won't have to put any personal security.
Right.
The government will provide that security, okay? However, if prior to this situation, somebody was going to apply for a loan and they were a greater risk, okay, for whatever reason, it could be that they don't have a great track record financially, they may not have any personal assets, they may not have been in business very long, they may recently graduated, there's all sorts of different factors. So then the banks would look at that individual as a higher risk. So then the rates would be higher. Okay, so they may be 7, 8, 9%, 10%, whatever it may be, because banks look at it from a risk point of view. So when that type of individual applies for a loan, the rates will be higher, and the banks can then ask for additional security on that individual, because they won't fall into what the government have provided the support with. Does that make sense?
Makes sense, yeah.
So the two different points. If somebody was let's say a grade A client, where they would have been approved very quickly, perhaps without security or little security, then that hasn't really changed. They won't have to put their own security moving forward. The bank are covering that. But somebody, if they'd have applied, let's say grade B, if they'd have applied, they would have had to put a lot more of their own personal security. The rates would have been higher, they may have had to put a larger cash injection, then the government aren't going to provide that security, because those individuals are perhaps using the coronavirus scenario to benefit them. Yeah. So they were perhaps not doing as well as they could have been in the first place. Again, I'm generalising here, so please don't shoot me down. But that just sort of gives you an indication on where we are and why we have the discrepancy with the two different rates. And you mentioned there that you've been, some people have mentioned 10%. I'm not surprised at that, but they would have still have paid 10% before all this started.
But what about, again, looking at alternative sources? Have you had any experience with sources of alternative funding? Because I know a few alternative funding companies who have been trying to talk to us, and apparently, their rates are normally higher because they're short-term loans, but they apparently have more liquidity in the market now because of being backed by venture or whatever it is. And what's that in there?
These have always been around. That's the thing. So what you'd always do when you're looking at any funding is go for mainstream funding. Okay, so the high street banks. Okay, now within high street banks, you've got specialist healthcare departments as well. So Lloyd's, Santander, all these different financial institutions. Well, not all of them. Some of them will specialise working within dentistry, and a lot of them are members of ASPD that Steve and I are members of as well. Now, what will happen is you'd go to them first because they understand dentistry. Now, if you're not successful with them, then you'll move down a layer or down a tier and so on, okay? And there's, way down here, you've got Wonga.
Yeah.
Okay, so you obviously want to be at the top where you're paying the lowest interest rates, the fees are as low as possible. But unfortunately, not everybody falls into that particular tier. So they have to move down to the next stage. And unfortunately, the further down you move, the more expensive the fees are, the more expensive the rates are.
And your chances and everything. So it's almost what we're looking at some level is almost the normal borrowing we look at. And I mean, Scott Phillips has commented that there's something in the papers today that 1.4% of CBIL applications have been successful. So we're still looking at similar sort of viewpoints there.
Yeah, I mean, there's only been 5,000 applications being successful, which out of, I think it was 3 million. It's really small numbers. But again, it comes back to the number of staff within the banks as well. So it's, don't think that all the others have been turned down. It just may be that their applications haven't been looked at yet. And, a lot of it is automated, but there will have to be human involvement as well with the applications, because it's soft funding, especially within dentistry, because there's no two dentists that are in the same position.
Yeah. And that's something that we have to look at, isn't it? So I agree with that. And in terms of, again, another thing about looking at all of these things is the staff issue. You're going to furlough some, you're not going to furlough others. I presume the first thing to say is once you furlough staff, you can't bring them back in. You can't do shift patterns, as the word may be. I'm furloughing you this week. You can come back next week and I'll furlough somebody else next week. You can't do that.
No, my understanding of the way the furlough regulations, such as they are, works is that you have to furlough for at least a minimum period of 3 weeks. And so during that period that the staff are furloughed, there would be nothing, as I understand it, for you then bringing staff back in and rotating the furlough around so that somebody else gets chosen for the furlough for a different period of at least a minimum period of 3 weeks. So you can operate it on that basis, but you can't do it on a week-by-week basis or anything of that nature, unfortunately.
Is this 3 weeks based on the fact that we were initially thinking the lockdown would be 3 weeks or 4 weeks? Or is just 3 weeks standard?
I frankly don't know the rationale for choosing the 3 week period, whether, as you rightly say, because we envisaged back in time that 3 weeks would be the extent of the crisis. I don't know, but certainly that is one very clear aspect of the regulations, that it is a minimum period of 3 weeks that you have to furlough employees for.
And go on. Sorry, you were
right at the start, if you remember, Boris said will shut down for 3 weeks. So that's probably where it came from.
Yeah, and that's probably, yeah, that's what I'm trying to think. Would it be?
Probably.
And talking about funding and stuff, Daniel Theo says, what if your separate income stream, as you've got a separate income stream as a self-employed worker that doesn't come from dentistry? Can you then claim your NHS income as well as your self-employed help from a totally unrelated field? I are we looking at being very careful around that as well because of the previous discussions we were saying?
I would say that from what the CDO said, you wouldn't be allowed to do that. But again, we were chatting before we came live, and you probably can proportionally. Okay, again, it's a difficult one because you don't want to ruin the bigger picture. But if you need to claim, you need to claim. And if you're only earning 10% NHS and 90% of your income is from other sources within or outside of dentistry, you've got to ask yourself, actually, is it financially viable to continue working within the NHS?
Yeah, and I think that's, but a huge amount of self-employed associates. They're again in two categories, and I don't know. Have you had this, Stephen Knowles, where some of them are sole traders, and some of them have registered limited entities in these respects?
In my experience, you tend to get more of associate companies in private practices.
Yeah.
There are issues, and there have been issues for some time about associates incorporating in an NHS practice because it can affect their superannuation entitlements. So it ought to be more prevalent in private practices where the associates have incorporated. Now, one of the problems with the self-help scheme as it currently stands is that unless you are remunerated through a limited company by PAYE, as I understand it, you are not eligible to apply for the support scheme if you remunerate yourself through dividends. And that is one big area that for incorporated traders throughout the country, be it dental or non-dental, that I would argue the government needs to seriously look at, because that could be a big problem moving forward.
I mean, that was already being discussed before all this happened. I think it was in their plans, the IR35. I presume the building contractors and everybody else has this anyway. What about the limited companies who are trying to buy practices? Because I presume, for example, there's an associate incorporated and they were using that to perhaps buy a practice. Have you seen any situations like that? And how do you deal with those now in this state?
I think, in all honesty, I think that limited company buyers, associate buyers, whoever they may be, are in the same problem of uncertainty generally. And also that many of the funders have decided that they too want to look at how this crisis is going to unravel or become more certain before they will release funds. Whether they have appropriate security for those loans or not almost becomes immaterial, because clearly the dental practice's ability to trade again and service any loan that's being taken out for practice purchase is key. So I'm afraid whether you're a limited company buyer, whether you're a sole trader, whether you're a partnership, if you're in the process of buying a dental practice, you need to look at the process very, very carefully. You need to consider soft pedaling, and you need to be speaking to your lender very, very carefully to ensure that A, they're happy to go ahead, B, the terms of the deal haven't altered, and so on and so forth, before you exchange contracts.
Sounds like a real moving feast, this, and as time goes on. I mean, surely the newspaper article, the BDA research, I think it was as well, where they're saying 1 in 5 practices are not going to push beyond, is it a month or 2 months of funding? Surely that must be sending panic to your clients and each one coming back to you saying, what do I do here on a regular basis? What do you tell them?
Well,
yeah. Sorry, Richard, I was just going to jump in there.
Go on, Richard, you can answer that first.
Well, that was only a survey. It's not factual information. That's not necessarily happening. And the only one practice I've seen closed down was on social media, which was Grimsby or somewhere up in the north. Aside from that, I've not heard of any other dental practices closed down. We've got in excess of 1,000 dentist clients. And, you know, yeah, it's difficult, but not to that stage. And maybe day one, people were running around like headless chickens because they didn't know where to turn. They didn't know where the next meal was going to come from.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't know what was going to happen with regards to all the staff. You know, if we go back to those early days, nobody had a clue what was going on. So there was panic, not even mild panic. There was panic, and people were thinking, God, I've got all these expenses because of all these different employment rules. You can't just lay people off, etc. But the government has finally started releasing information, not as quick as it perhaps should, but nevertheless, it's released a lot of information. And the information that's been released now, it's getting to the more intricate detail, and that's what people like Steve and myself need to know. Yeah, it's great having the bigger picture, but we need to know the really small details, because when we're recommending to dentists what they can and can't do, what they should and shouldn't be doing, it does come down to us as professional advisors. And we don't want to be jumping on the bandwagon where we're shooting from the hip, saying, oh, this is what the situation is. If tomorrow some more detail comes out and we were giving people incorrect information, and there's enough incorrect information out there on Facebook and all these different dental groups, on a lot of WhatsApp groups as well, unfortunately. And then it's like Chinese whispers. One dentist says something to the next dentist, and it just creates mayhem. And it doesn't actually provide any, well, first of all, clarity, but also it gets everybody down.
Yeah.
People should be a lot more positive than I think they are. There are benefits that are coming out, not as many as we would like to have hope that will come out, but, you know, give it time. People
Mind you, we actually ended up in this sort of lockdown just, I say just, but 3 weeks ago, 21 days ago. And we've had this much information come out. So we don't know how further down the line will be 21 days from now and 42
Absolutely.
days from now. So I guess we've got to be sensible. But the problem then happens that how we plan, that's the big issue. Saleh, Dr. Aria says, you know, he's a mixed practice. My practice is 27% NHS, 73% private. Do you know how many percent of the NHS staff have to be paid? Who do I, you know, fund in this? You know, who do I furlough in this? What are your thoughts on that with the limited information we have available?
Yeah, it's quite interesting on that particular question. The gentleman who asked that question, if he hasn't done already, he should take himself onto the BDA website. They do go into some detail in terms of furloughing and NHS payments in mixed practices. Now, their approach appears to be to do it in a kind of time basis. So the example they give is a practice that has 2/3 NHS, 1/3 private income. And they basically say, well, let's assume that the crisis is going to last for 3 months. You should furlough your staff for 1 month of that 3-month period in proportion to your private income, and then pay your NHS staff for the remaining 2/3 in accordance with the NHS contract payments that you're getting. And so they're taking a kind of strictly separate time-based approach to furloughing and NHS payments in NHS practices. Now, I must admit, when the scheme was first announced, I had it envisaged in my own mind some kind of process whereby you would simply furlough and pay your staff on a month-by-month basis simultaneously. And so all you would do in your furlough claim is claim your proportion of private income on a month-by-month basis. BDA's approach is rather different, and they are suggesting that you cannot furlough your employees and pay them NHS payments at the same time. And that's why they're proposing you separate it out in time, if you can.
It's very interesting. Where we're ending up is making sure you don't, you know, open every tap for your benefit. Be careful how you go with the aspects here. That's what it is saying.
I think the key thing is, and this seems to be reflected in a lot of the guidance that we do, is to document why you're doing what you're doing and keep the evidence available in written format to justify what you're doing. So, for example, in the mixed private case where you've got NHS stroke private income, you're going to need to document what proportion of your overall income is private. Therefore, why have you decided to furlough staff in this manner? Why have you decided to pay NHS staff in this manner, and so on and so forth? I think provided you can keep that documentation, and provided there is, in quotes, a sound justification for doing that, you're well on the way to be able to sleep soundly if HMRC ever come and do a reconciliation at the end of this crisis.
And stepping up again from your role as a commercial solicitor, practice sales have probably been held back, maybe people thinking. But do you think short term, long term, medium term, this is going to have any impact on valuations? And do you then have to go back and revalue things because we don't know where things will be?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts for practices that are in any of this situation at the moment?
Yeah, it's an interesting time. I mean, it comes with the caveat that I'm not a dental practice valuer. However, having said that, obviously dental practice sales, sellers have enjoyed high goodwill values for quite some time now. It doesn't take a great genius to work out that this crisis is not going to help goodwill values moving forward by any means. And sadly, particularly perhaps for private practices, and in particular those that have a high percentage of fee per item as a component of their goodwill value. I can see a situation where goodwill values for those practices in particular will start to, if not level off, may well actually fall. So that perhaps is an outcome of the crisis. I can see, sadly, transactions that perhaps haven't got to an exchange of contracts where buyers are going to turn around at some time and say, well, actually, what I'm thinking I want to buy is not now worth what I thought it was. And so there may well be either some renegotiation around pricing, or perhaps even some what I would call creative thinking around payment. So whereas at one time you might pay 100% of the purchase price at completion, it might be that at the very least the buyers are thinking of saying, well, do you know what? I think I should be now paying another 20% in stage payments over time. It might be that they take the view that there has to be some form of earn out of the consideration, so that I will pay you a percentage of the purchase price based on what the practice actually does in the future, and so on and so forth. So we're beginning to see that from buyers in terms of a little bit more savviness around the purchase price generally. And I think that process will only continue the longer that this crisis goes on for.
And I think, sorry, go on, Richard. Yes, you're saying something?
Steve, that happens at the moment with the larger corporates when they buy a practice already. So it's obviously going to filter through, because corporates, you know, generally they're just looking at the spreadsheet. They're looking at the financial benefits to their group, because at some point at a later date they may decide to get venture capitalists in, float the corporate, etc. So it all comes down to values of EBITDA. But anyway, we'll talk about that another time.
But I think invariably going further forward, we have to, as Joe Joshi says, we have to hit the ground running when we return to work. But
Absolutely.
ground running, you know, your staff, because we're going to have all these patients who have been having almost a pent-up demand, right? People who've been not visited a dentist for a while. What implication is this going to have on staff? They, you know, we furloughed them, yes, but as soon as they come back, they may be needed for longer than contracted hours. And what do you do here in that respect? Any thoughts?
Well, it's an interesting one. The thought that went through my mind, which is quite a semi-amusing one, is that obviously people are not able to take annual leave currently to do anything meaningful with it anyway. So that when we, in quotes, get back to normal, is the first thing that you're going to face as an employer is leave application forms coming in from staff right, left and centre, just at the very time when your patients are flocking through the doors of the surgery, comparatively speaking, to seek treatments. So you may want to be thinking now in terms of how you handle leave requests moving forward in that very period when you need to maximise your practice staff to deal with the capitation payments, the routine maintenance, and so on and so forth, that inevitably is going to be built up during this crisis. So that's certainly one aspect of it. Obviously, I think it depends on which staff you're talking about. Your employees clearly aren't particularly under any obligation to do extra unless paid overtime for it. They may want to do so voluntarily as, in quotes, a thank you to the practice owner for being kept on during this crisis, but that would need to be a matter of agreement for them. Obviously, when it comes to associates, perhaps if you think of associates under a private capitation scheme, they may well be being paid now under that capitation scheme for treatments that are building up into the future. And so there may need to be a discussion from the practice owner to his associates to say along the lines of, you do realise, chaps, that some of the payment or some of the treatments that you are doing now relates to payments that you've already had, and so on and so forth. But I think a prudent practice owner will now use the time to prepare for what's likely to be a surge in demand from patients when the practice is reopened. And then there are resource implications clearly amongst both employees and associates as to who's available and how they're going to be paid for that extra work. So certainly.
It's a good time to position for a principal or principals to position with their teams about what's going to happen in the future. And, they can be having the discussions now about what they should be not necessarily expected to do, but find out what people are wanting to do as well. Because, like I said earlier, we're all in it together. And if you have an employee that is aware that, their position's still kept open, if they've been furloughed, the practice will have certain needs and demands once the doors are allowed to open again, then, we're all humans at the end of the day. And I think generally we're good people, and the good people will want to help the practice out because the practice has helped them out whilst they can. And I'm led to believe that a lot of businesses out there, that even though they've furloughed team members, a lot of practices will pay the balance up to 100%. Now, I'm not saying that every single one will, and there's no obligation whatsoever to do that, but imagine the goodwill that creates to your team if you do turn around and say, actually, yes, government, from a government's point of view, we only have to pay you 80%, but forget all that. We're going to do the right thing. We're going to pay you 100% over the next 12 months because we're a little bit weak at the moment. And I think that will create so much goodwill with the team members that then they may think, well, yeah, doing an extra few hours here and there, not expecting overtime. I think you'll be surprised what people will do.
One of the big messages emanating from all the discussions we had associates on last night discussing, we have now, is this very important fact that away from solid contracts, solid transactions, measured things, goodwill, discussions between people. This is probably one time where I think true leadership, true teamwork, true goodwill is going to outlast anything else that'll help us tide through this. And I think people have to understand we are going a bit back and forth here because the comments are flying in like crazy, and time is tight. But Farad Momeni, I'm sorry, I'm a bit late with the comment. What about directors of limited companies, private associates? We were saying that directors of limited companies, can they furlough themselves as the limited company provides a basic salary and the remainder as dividends? Where does dividends fall into this? Any thoughts?
Well, do you want to go, Steve, or shall I?
You go, Richard. I'll pop in.
Give us your insight, Richard.
My understanding is that a director can be furloughed, okay, and they are allowed to continue doing complete their obligations as a director. So they're not allowed to market themselves like, I'm a director, so I wouldn't be allowed to do a webinar to a bunch of dentists. That would be breaking the furlough rules, okay? But I could actually still continue with the regular meetings, etc. So all the legal requirements, all the compliance aspects, I would be allowed to do. But over and above that, my understanding is you're not allowed to do it. Steve, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and also it touches upon the difficulty of what you're claiming for that directorship during furlough. If you're paid through the PAYE system, then I understand you can furlough those wages up to the statutory caps and so on and so forth. But my understanding is that when it relates to dividends, those cannot effectively be reclaimed during the furlough arrangement. So if, as is commonly the place, directors pay themselves a very small basic salary and then take the rest of their remuneration in dividends, what you're going to be able to reclaim from the government in that furlough situation, even if you are prepared as a director to stand down apart from the statutory duties that Richard's talked about, is going to be pretty small in the grand scheme of things.
600 or 700 quid a month. It's not worth a hassle.
And yeah, you've got to play the line again. It's saying the same thing. Don't tap into many taps again.
Absolutely.
Have you had any questions regarding the NHS contracts and associates? You know, have principals, what is your advice to principals paying associates? Is it 100% of what they did last year, or is it sensible to tell the associates, can we hold back a little bit because we don't know? Again, I'm going to say it's leadership, teamwork, discussions, goodwill. But what are your experiences and advice you can put into that? Bobby Banlish has asked this question, and so I put it to you.
I would say do what's fair. Do what you think. Obviously, the business, if they are paying more money than is coming in, they're not going to be in business very long. Okay. So looking at the bigger picture, then the principal and the practice need more time. And if the associate's in a position where they can appreciate the financial loading that's been put on the practice, then I think that as long as they're discussing things and they can unravel things at a later date, you know, in 3-6 months' time, whenever it may be, I think that's the best action plan. Because it's not healthy for the associate to expect to receive exactly the same as they were prior to this situation. Although what is right may be that the associate is entitled to exactly that, but you've got to have use your common sense here and what's right for everybody, because you don't want to be bankrupting the practice that you're working for, but adversely, you don't want your associates starving.
I think that's the main thing, really, isn't it? We need to sort of almost work around this in a very, very teamwork way, really, to make sure everyone survives through this and rides through this. And it's the same way as Hatim says, in a mixed practice, let's say 40-60, with 6 staff, 40% NHS, can you furlough 4 staff and keep 2 from the NHS income? Or do you have to rotate, you know, every 3 weeks, assuming the practice will be closed for a while? Can you do this mixing?
Well, again, it comes back to the comment that you can certainly rotate staff around on furlough.
Yeah.
And so if you decide that the fairest way of dealing with the furlough situation in the practice is that not every individual is put out to furlough and half work constantly, and there is a rotation of staff around in terms of who's furloughed on 3-week blocks, you can certainly do that. And it gets you home from any kind of discrimination type questions that you could face as a practice owner if you are permanently furloughing certain members of staff and allowing other members of staff, in quotes, to work normally. So it kind of assists you in that way. So you can certainly do that. The difficulty that you face in a mixed practice is what we talked about earlier, in the sense that at the moment, because of the interrelation between private and NHS sources of support, certainly the BDA guidance is you can't furlough staff and at the same time pay them their NHS entitlements. And so you have to try and do it on a time basis where you are furloughing staff for their private income time and then defurloughing them, if that makes sense, for their NHS payments.
And I think that's important to keep this in mind again. I think the same message, kindly and sensibly following again, having discussions. Very useful advice here, guys. Very useful. Just tell me one thing. We are obviously tight on time, but I really want to know one important thing, both from Richard and Stephen. Planning. In uncertain times, planning financially and strategically. Give us some thoughts on how do you want, or would you advise practices to plan ahead strategically? What sort of things would really give them good cones, markers, pillars to lean against as they move forward?
I think in the short term, as I mentioned before, income and expenditure, that's really important, making sure that they've got the finances as lean as possible today, but also with a plan of action where they may decide to introduce new bits of kit into their practices at a later date. You know, we are all guilty of liking the latest, the shiniest bits of kit, but the business has always been running. It maybe not as efficiently as it could be with this shiny piece of kit, but in 6 months' time, or 6 months after all this is over, maybe think about this time and think, actually, do I really need that piece of kit? And if I did have this piece of kit and there's another problem like the coronavirus, do I really need it? Because that will start making you think, more sensibly over the items that you have in your practice. The kit you've got already, will it last for an extra 6 months? Is it an ego thing that you think, well, yeah, okay, I would like that new piece of kit. There's a bit of an offer on. Why don't I buy it now? But if you don't need it, don't buy it. That's some of the best advice that you'll have. And shop around as well. Don't just go to one supplier or provider. Speak to half a dozen. Get a list of pros and cons. Speak to your advisors as well, and find out if you really, really do need it, and work out what the actual costs and benefits of having it. And if the rug is pulled from under your feet again, like it has done at the moment, how will you exit from that?
And I think from a clinical viewpoint as well, I almost try and think the kind of dentistry you'll be doing. We're going to have members of the public who may not have as many disposable funds. So what are the things that will come through? What are the important things that will be needed in practice to cope with that kind of treatment? And therefore, the kit you invest in has to meet what you think is going to come through the door, not what was coming through the door before this happened.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a glass half full kind of guy, and I think that there's a lot of opportunities coming through this, and the upskilling that's available for every single person on Earth, or pretty much. There's certain individuals, certain countries that they just don't have the upskilling potential, but for us within dentistry, we can all upskill. Learn new things. It might be just about negotiations. It doesn't have to be linked to you as a clinician. It could be more business, become more business savvy. Learn about HR, learn about financial, learn about law. There's so much out there, and you've got the time. You really do. So use this as in effect, you're paying thousands and thousands of pounds for an MSc or whatever the post grad course may be. Use this time. You're not getting paid, or we've already discussed the payment issues. So use it. Rather than having to go to London or Edinburgh for a course, do it in your own lounge.
I think that's very, very true. It's available on your screen, and where they're all logged on right now, there's things around there they can use on tubules. Stephen, what are your thoughts again? Planning, strategy, from a legal perspective, from a strategic perspective?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I think, as we've kind of discussed today, I think it comes into two distinct camps, really. You've got the immediate financial survival type planning to do. So if you haven't done it already, get onto the government website, look at all the available sources of funding support that there are there, drop down each menu, work out, am I eligible for that? Am I not eligible for that? Consider applying for it if you are. So do all you can for the immediate financial crisis. But I think also just strategically, there are opportunities and threats ahead that you need to start thinking about. So, for example, what proportion of my fee income is currently made up of fee per item, private capitation, NHS income? What proportion moving forward should I have for those three components? I think there are some clear indications that the current crisis has given us in terms of which direction of travel you might want to think about in those areas. That's something that I think you clearly want to be doing. You might want to think for yourself, do I want to stay in dentistry at all? And that may be the right strategic decision for you in terms of, once I've survived this crisis and once I've got my business back onto an even keel, is selling the right option for me, notwithstanding the fact that goodwill values may have changed or altered. It still might be the best outcome for you. Equally, if you are an entrepreneurial type of practice owner, you might take the opportunity now to think that actually, for the first time in a long time, there's some good value out there in terms of buying and adding to your portfolio of dental practices and so on and so forth. So there are threats, but there are also opportunities for people out there who are willing to sit down and think about it moving forward.
And in fact, talking of opportunities, this is an interesting one that's just coming from Zach, I think it is, and he's saying that let's talk about alternative funding options in this situation, right? Here's an opportunity of a near retired principal. He's kind of been in the game for long, was thinking of calling it a day anyway. He's enjoying lockdown life and and basically says, I can't be asked to go back into this clinical dentistry and the stress. There's a young associate in practice um, who may say, actually, I've got an opportunity here, but I haven't got the funds. How about some sort of alternative funding that basically says to the principal, don't come back, I'll buy the practice from you, um, but I won't pay you a lump sum. I'll pay you 20% over 5 years or something. I'll elongate the payment with interest. Do you think that's an option? Do you think funding like that would be available? Is that an opportunity to look into these sort of things?
Well, it is. There's already peer-to-peer funding anyway available, but this is, I guess that's what most corporates do anyway, but it's normally 70-30 or 80-20 over a period of time, which is what we discussed a bit earlier on in the webinar. So yeah, things like that, brilliant opportunities. Just make sure you've got specialist lawyers that, like Steve, that will make sure that all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted on the agreement between both parties.
And that's going to be important really in this situation. And if we were to wind down, I'm sorry if I've not relayed anybody's questions, but for those of you who are in the practice owners WhatsApp groups, Richard is on there, and Stephen, you're welcome to be on there as well. And we will add you on, but you'll be able to give more advice. I think things are evolving. So one of the things I may ask is we bring you back in a few weeks' time with updates coming through. It would be very useful as well. So thank you. One last parting comment, anything from Stephen first, please.
Yeah, I think it's easy to be too downhearted by the current crisis. I think, yes, planning to survive the immediate crisis is clearly got to be key. But my own view is we will emerge from this. Dentistry and hopefully law too will emerge from this in some form or other. Those that emerge the best will be those that have taken the time to think about putting their operations in order and are also thinking strategically about how to re-emerge from this crisis. So the time that you spend doing that now is time well spent, in my view.
And what do you say to them, Richard?
I echo what Steve just said. It's really about planning. You've got time on your side now. Look at this as the positives that can come out of it. Yes, we are where we are. It's not a great position, but we are where we are, and we're all in it together. So yeah, roll your sleeves up. Think about how you can develop your practices, develop you as individuals as well. Make sure that when we come out at the end of this in a few weeks, a few months, then you're in the strongest position possible, and there'll be a lot of opportunities out there as well. The financial markets are quite depressed at the moment. There will be people that want to take advantage of that with making investments, things like cryptocurrency, all sorts of practices. There's all sorts of different things that you can take advantage of to make it into a positive. And unfortunately in life, there's always losers, but we want to make sure that we are giving the information so we have as many winners as possible. And I think stay positive, everybody. It's a difficult profession to work in. We're going through difficult times, but yeah, just be positive, keep smiling, and we'll get through this together.
Well, it's a brilliant message. And I think I read somewhere that the Great Depression of the 1920s was followed by one of the most prosperous periods on earth. So with that thought process in mind, I'd like to end this live stream. Thank you so much for having spent the last hour with us, Stephen and Richard.
Pleasure. Thank you.
We'd welcome you in a few weeks' time again. Anybody has any further questions, please ask us along. Otherwise, we will see you again this evening at 7:30 when the Geek Out gang are back with their Geek Out clinical composite. Tonight it's only preps, actually, that they come through. This is Tubules Live together. Keep positive, keep smiling. Thank you, everyone. Have a good one.